to this morning's online Bible study. Whether you're tuning in at Twitter or Periscope at Bible Study Cam, whether you're on Facebook.com/reflective Bible study, whether you're on YouTube at the Online Preacher, or even at the onlinepreacher.com/live, wherever you happen to be tuning in, whether it's one of those places or somewhere else, whether you're watching this live and coming in right now or watching this on replay, I want to welcome you to this morning's online Bible study. And this morning, we're going to be looking at one of the most politically incorrect passages out of the Gospels and digging in and discovering exactly what Jesus is talking about and who Jesus is talking to. Because too often, those at least who get offended by this passage, they likely haven't read this passage, or they don't understand the context in which Jesus is saying the message that he says. So let's read this passage, but before jumping to conclusions or jumping to an endpoint or feeling like this passage is talking about you, listen for a moment and see if you might be able to get into Jesus's frame of mind and see how he frames this big debate. So this is Matthew chapter 19. We're going to start in verse 1, and I'm going to read from the New Century Version. After Jesus said all these things, he left Galilee and went into the area of Judea on the other side of the Jordan River. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Verse 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus and tried to trick him. They asked, "Is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any reason he chooses?" Jesus answered. This is interesting because this passage here is framed by the Pharisees coming to Jesus with the intention of trying to trick him, so they bring Jesus the most politically incorrect question, you could say, for any period in history. From Adam and Eve and the fall, all the way up to that time and all the way beyond that time to today, the issue of marriage and divorce and all of that is one sticky, sore, politically incorrect issue for one reason or another. But listen how Jesus responds, because the way Jesus frames his response is fascinating. Verse 4, Jesus answered, "Surely you have read in the scriptures, when God made the world," this is referencing way back to the very beginning, "when God made the world, he made them male and female. And God said, so a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one body. So there are not two, but one. God has joined the two together, so no one should separate them." Now this is fascinating before coming to the Pharisees' follow-up question. But this is fascinating because this is Jesus reframing the issue. The Pharisees had framed this issue as Jesus is saying one thing and Moses said something different. And Jesus reframes this issue to say, let's even look further back than Moses to the very beginning. Let's look at God's ideal. The way God structured and planned and put in place. This is looking at the world before sin had infected it. And Jesus frames the discussion and frames this issue with God's ideal. And then verse 7, the Pharisees asked, "Why then did Moses give a command for a man to divorce his wife by giving her divorce papers?" Well, the Pharisees have a somewhat logical follow-up question to this. They say, well, yeah, we understand that's God's ideal, but with that being God's ideal, why then would Moses have allowed us, or why would he then have moved away? What prompted him to move away from that ideal? We can't argue with that ideal, that framing that you give this issue, that God created male and female in the beginning and that God had directed that to be the case. That's his ideal. So then why did Moses deviate from this ideal? Because Moses should have allied and stayed aligned with God's ideal. Verse 8, Jesus answered, "Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refused to accept God's teaching. But divorce was not allowed in the beginning." Now, this is fascinating because imagine a world where divorce was not allowed. It's almost crazy to think about because there are plenty of situations in the world today where divorce would be advisable. But Jesus challenges those present with this idea that at the very beginning, divorce was not allowed. Which is incredibly challenging to think about. But Jesus continues, verse 9, "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman is guilty of adultery." That's bad enough. That's breaking one of the 10 commandments. "The only reason for a man to divorce his wife is if his wife has sexual relations with another man," aka adultery, aka breaking one of the 10 commandments. Verse 10, "The followers said to him," this is fascinating because now it shifts off of the Pharisees bringing this trick question to Jesus, and now Jesus' own followers, the crowd and the disciples, then say to Jesus, "Well, if that is the only reason a man can divorce his wife, it is better not to marry." It's interesting because the followers, I think most of the disciples at that point were single, but they might have been elbowing Peter, who had a mother-in-law, and in order to have a mother-in-law, you have to have a wife. They could be elbowing Peter to say, "Hey, too bad for you, you've already gotten married." Because if that's the only reason a man can divorce his wife according to this ideal, but that situation is not ideal, it is better not to marry. In verse 11, Jesus answered, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but God has made some able to accept it. There are different reasons why some men cannot marry. Some men were born without the ability to become fathers. Others were made that way later in life by other people. And some men have given up marriage because of the kingdom of heaven." But here's the key. "But the person who can marry should accept this teaching about marriage." This is challenging because Jesus sets up this, what seems like an insane ideal for marriage, looking back at God's ideal from the beginning. Jesus gives one exception, which we might say that's a little too few amount of exceptions. There can be a handful of other cases, at least in my own mind, that I would say those would be valid and appropriate reasons to get divorced, but Jesus doesn't include those. But it's interesting because Jesus frames marriage as a choice. And too often people don't understand or don't see marriage as a choice. It's almost like culture says, yes, you're going to grow up, you're going to get married, you're going to have children, and that's the path that your life should take. But Jesus, in this conclusion, he frames that path as being one option. But he also frames there being several other paths, and these other paths don't include marriage. Which is interesting because there's a stigma, you could say, or there's a perception that's in culture that those who haven't gotten married, or those who don't have a significant other and are acting married, you could say, those people are missing out. Those people aren't as, they don't have a whole life or a full life, and that is a lie. Because we don't know what God's plan is for other people. Sometimes we barely know what God's plan is for us. So if we barely know us, how could we even know what God's plan is for someone else? But this teaching, this challenging truth, is a standard that Jesus sets up for his followers. his followers are challenged to look to the ideal and try to get as close to the ideal as we possibly can get. And this contrasts with culture, which wants to pull the ideal down. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. Culture doesn't necessarily want to pull the ideal down. Culture wants to ignore the ideal and normalize a level that is vastly below it, and then try to pull everyone down if they even try to live above what that ideal is, or if they try to live above what the culture's norm is. So culture pulls the ideal and says, we're not going to even focus on that ideal. That ideal is unrealistic. We're going to live down here. And if you want to even come close to living above the norm, then we're going to try to pull you down to the norm, because anybody who's living beyond the norm of culture is seen as somebody who's trying to attack the culture. And that is vastly not right. That is incredibly false. But at any rate, I digress talking about this, but let's remember that regardless of this issue of marriage and divorce, let's remember that God has an ideal, and he has challenged us to come as close to that ideal as we can possibly get. We're sinners, we screw up, we mess up, that's true. But that doesn't mean that we stop trying. And as we move step by step forward in life, looking at Jesus, focusing on Jesus, let's ally and align our lives with him, and let him transform our lives into reflecting his love and his character to the world around us. And while culture might not understand why we do what we do, we know it's because we are saying thank you to Jesus for everything he has already done for us. So thank you for tuning in, whether you're tuning in at Twitter, Periscope, Facebook, YouTube, or somewhere else, whether you're watching this live or watching the replay. Thank you for tuning in. And if this passage or idea has challenged you, or if I explained it in a way that made sense to you that you hadn't seen it before, then jump into any one of the comment boxes and let me know. And I know that Periscope's comment box will end as soon as this live stream ends, but I will be able to see it. I just won't be able to respond. But Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, I'll be able to respond to those comments periodically throughout the day as I'm able to. And let's keep this conversation going. Because while all of us have fallen short of God's ideal, let's stay connected digitally and encourage one another to stay focused on God's ideal as we move towards eternity. And so thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.